So I really wanted to learn more about the Angular 5 router. And I know that with all frameworks, sometimes you only can understand where the rough edges are and where the interesting facets are by performing a non-trivial exploration. So rather than trying to come up with some simple demos, what I wanted to try and do in an audacious and scary way was try and recreate the interface for InVision App using the Angular 5 router. It was actually the Angular 4 router when I started this because I've actually been working on it for about 4.5 months on and off, not strictly the entire time. And it ended up just being a whole lot more work than I expected, and I ran into all kinds of super interesting problems with Angular and hurdles and interesting things about scroll retention and how you can use secondary outlets and dealing with event propagation and keyboard shortcuts and just all kinds of super interesting stuff. But let me just show you what I have here. So here's my list of projects, and I'll just kind of click through some of the more simple things. Right, we have just a bunch of sections here with content. The interesting thing about this page is I had to learn how to implement fragments because Angular doesn't currently support fragments out of the box, so I had to learn how to do that. You can see here I have spinners where I'm using simulated network latency. This is all just in-memory data, right? And here's my people section. I have my person here, and you can see that I have a bunch of different sections for me, but if I go to, say, one of the other users, I get just limited stuff here. I tried to create as many of the modal windows as I could because the modals are controlled by a secondary outlet, and you can see here I can add this user to different boards and prototypes. I mean, none of this is actually functional, right? The routes are all functional, but the data doesn't get persisted. If I go to activity is just boring. Oh, you can see I have the z-index problem there. The projects, so all the stuff here, right, is in the primary outlet. So if I click into, say, a particular detail here, you could see one that it was nested loading there. I don't know if you could see that. So if I click back here, it'll be one nesting and then a secondary nesting. So I have this nesting views, and each of the nesting has its own set of data that it has to load dynamically before it can load its child view. And it's very exciting because it took a long time for conditional router outlets to be available in Angular, and now that it is, it's super fast, super exciting. I can change the entire view here, right? I go from the primary view sort of to the console view. Inside the console view, I have a bunch of different modes here: preview, build, comments. I can do this with keyboard shortcuts, P, B, C, I, H. If I do Command F here, this was kind of exciting. If I do Command F, it opens up my my screen browser here, and I can type here, and I can hit that one. I can do my arrow keys here to move from section to section. Share modal, of course, will work here, and you can see that it's actually pulling the right project from the share from the URL, right? So I'm in the email templates, and when I go to share, it's pulling email templates here. If I jump over to a different project like mobile app v1, and I go in here, and you can see I can do share. Now it's mobile app v1, and that's because this modal is actually pulling the project ID out of the URL. Very exciting stuff for me. What else can I show you that's interesting? I tried to work on a couple of very interesting, I think, secondary outlets. So for example, product updates here is a secondary outlet, so you can see that I can navigate around the app, and the product outlets are maintained. I wish I could actually maintain them less, but because of the constraints around some of the way secondary outlets work in Angular, they have to be inside non-empty path segments, and I have an empty path segment for my main view for my standard layout, so I couldn't use a secondary outlet in it. But anyway, some more interesting stuff, like if I scroll down to the bottom of this, you'll notice that it doesn't accidentally scroll the parent page, and that's because I'm dealing with all this scroll trapping so that the scroll doesn't bubble up in an unexpected way. Also, if I scroll down to the bottom here and I go in here, what you'll see, first of all, is that, again, this is all driven by the URL, which is super exciting. So if I where am I? So if I go into microservice brainstorming and I'm in this particular product update and then I refresh, what you'll see is that we end up exactly in the same place. We're in microservice brainstorming, we're in this particular thing, and that's because, again, it's all driven by the URL. I could open up a different thing here, my inbox, right? And I can click through to this. And again, this is all driven by the URL. So if I refresh, we're in the same place. Very exciting because now I can copy and paste things like this to other people. Another thing that I wanted to do was I'm fascinated with the idea of including search queries inside of the URL. So for example here, if I do, let's say, email templates, what you'll see here is that I have this filter text in the URL. And the reason that this is exciting for me is now if I click into email templates and then I click the back button, I go back to the same view with the same filtering. So the filtering itself is again driven by the URL. So now I can copy and paste this to someone else. I can have multiple secondary views open at the same time. So let me see if I can, it's a little bit hard for me to show you in a view that's so small here, but if I go to product updates, and then I got to actually open my browser a little bit more to get the inbox link available. And now I can have my inbox open, and you can see that my secondary outlet here for the product updates continues to function in the background, no problem. What else can I do here? We can go to a missing project, and you can see that that redirected me back to a modal window for not found, and this is actually inside of an error modal window. And the exciting thing about this is that, as we saw before, when I refreshed the page, everything stayed in the same place. But this time, if I refresh this page, you shouldn't see that error modal because I actually have a route guard that says, hey, never show an error modal upon page refresh, because that's probably not the intent of the user. The user's probably refreshing to try and get rid of that modal. Now that's not strictly true with all modals. For example, if I have the share modal open here and I refresh, you'll see that we get back to the share modal because the share modal is something that you might want to be able to link to somebody, right? It's relevant state that's driven by that URL. Some interesting, I don't know, so much interesting stuff here. I feel like I don't even know what to show you. But what else? I'll just go through some of the other sections. Upgrade profile or upgrade plan. Again, this is all just driven by the URL. I can click through. And the beautiful thing about, again, the driven by the URL is that the back button works, the forward button works, right? I can go from one modal window to another modal window. Here's the one for the enterprise, schedule a demo, success, very exciting. Another thing that was difficult was the use of back buttons and scroll offset. This one took me quite a while to figure out. So for example, if I go to product updates here and I scroll down to the bottom, right, and let's say I look at the last one. Now if I hit the back button, what you'll notice is that I'm still scrolled down. And this is accomplished through a polyfill that I created that helps me create a more intuitive scroll behavior. And it's not just for the secondary, for this particular view, it's for all the views. So for example, if I go back here and I scroll down, so we're at the bottom of the list of prototypes, and now I go into this particular or this is a freehand, and then I go back, you'll see that I'm automatically scrolled back to the bottom of the list of prototypes because projects, to get that intuitive browser-based behavior that people have been used to over the last 20 years. What else can I show you? So this is not a feature complete in any way. This was just like a very exciting deep dive exploration. Not all of these things work, but again, I tried to create as many of the sort of like little interesting view-driven features that I can. I'm just gonna think for a second, right? Like if I want to create a new prototype, this is again driven by URL. So again, like I could send someone a link to the create new project URL, right? Like if I refresh now, you'll see that I'm still in that create project, and I can say blam, and of course none of this will persist, but it'll take me to a board in this case. Again, you know, just another thing that was fun to think about was keyboard shortcuts, right? So I can do left and right, and you can see that I'm going to be loading the different items in this particular board. And trying to think of what else might be interesting to show. This is a link that's not valid. So this was just an exploration of the double star, the asterisk asterisk catch-all So you can see I catch all and I redirect to a not found page. All right, so let's just take a really quick look at how this actually works from a code standpoint. So here's my application module. This is the module that gets bootstrapped. And what I ended up doing was creating the routes as a known at compile time tree of module provided routes. And what I mean by that is you can see that inside this router module for root, I have almost nothing. I'm essentially just deferring to the root module, the root view module, shell view, and I'm grabbing a static property off of that module called routes. Now, that's essentially how it works all the way down. It's turtles all the way down in terms of route definition. So if we look at the shell view module, the shell view module turns around and pretty much does the same thing. It says, okay, let's create a componentless path at the top, and then I'm just going to defer to all of my child modules to provide their routes. So you can see we're building up this route tree as we go down through the modules. So let's take a look at the standard view module, which is the next one down. And if I click into that one, you can see also very similar. This has a pathless wrapper, which is why I couldn't have secondary outlets inside of it. But you can see that it essentially turns around and defers to its child modules. And if we go ahead and look at, say, something like the projects view, the projects view only has a list view module inside of it, so it defers to its list view, and then its list view, you can see here, defines its list. So we have this sort of a telescoping configuration of routes. The super unfortunate downside to this is I can't look in one place and see all of the routes that the application provides. But the really nice thing about this, let me jump into one that has some more modules, the standard view. The really nice thing about this is that I don't have to rename anything. That each particular segment within a route essentially knows only about the children that it owns and about its local route segment. It doesn't have to worry about how its children's do things, unless it has to define a link that actually links there. Ultimately, right, like it's kind of a silly thing to think about decoupling in a route-based application, because we can decouple as much as we want, but ultimately the moment you cross-link from one view to another view, having to know about routes completely couples the entire application together. So we can create modularity, but the modularity only goes so far. So for example, for me, the modularity is all about not having to rename modules on import, not having to worry about name collisions, being able to define declarations that are local to a particular view. Like, I love the modularity from that standpoint. But ultimately, right, like if we look at the application here, because this is not super cross-linked, it's hard to explain, but like if I go into my people section and then I was going to go look at my own activity, and the activity was a list of projects, and I wanted to be able to click from my activity over to a project, well, now my activity needs to know how to generate links to a completely different module that may or may not even be loaded in the application yet, right, if we were doing lazy loading. So, modularity is nice, but the second we're doing anything non-trivial where modules link to other modules using routes, then we basically shot modularity in the face at that point, and now our application is tightly coupled. So modularity is fun, but it only takes you so far with routes. Let me drag my file structure over for a second, because I really enjoyed what I came up with here for the file structure. Essentially, all of the routable views end in this dash view structure, and the folder structure of the views mirrors the hierarchical structure of the application itself from the user's perspective, right? So if we think about, let's go back to the application for a second, right? If we think about going back to the root here, we're in the app and we're looking at the projects list. So this is the standard view, meaning just like this is the primary layout. So if we want to find the projects list, well, it's in the views folder, and this is the standard view, right? And then this is the projects view inside the standards view, and then this is the list view, right? So here is the list view component for this page, and you can see that the folder structure, again, mirrors the actual structure of the application from a user experience standpoint. And what I really enjoy about this is that it makes the files, at least in my opinion, super easy to find, because if I know where I am in the application, then I know how to find the file, right? So if I go, say, from my projects to, let's say, a board, the board here is no longer inside the standard layout, right? And if we look up in the URL, we can see it's app boards 3, and the folder structure will be the exact same. So if we go back up here, if we do app, views, and then, oh, here's boards right under the app, and here's its whole detail view and its items view and so on and so forth, because that's exactly how the user interface provides it. So that's how a file system provides it as well. The other pattern that I sort of happened upon was that each of my views, and this is not strictly a one-to-one correlation, but it is in the majority of cases, each one of my views also has a module associated with it. So I have standard view, and then I have my standard view module, and then this is done, again, primarily because I had to be able to define routes on each routable view. So each routable view had to know which routes it accepted, and then had to know which children it could defer to. So I ended up having to create a module for each view in order to do that. But that also had some benefit in that it allowed me to create directives that were local. So for example, if we look at my projects list here, this projects list is actually a collection of prototypes, boards, and freehands, right? And each of these has a slightly different UI. And if we look at the projects view, and we look at the list view here, and we look at the HTML, what we can see is that inside my list, sorry, I know that's getting a little cut off here. You can see that I have different things. I have prototype item, board item, freehand item, and that's to do the different UIs for the tiles there. And if we look at the module for the list view, what we can see is that that board item, freehand item, prototype item, those are actually declarations that are local to this particular view. Right, so here's my list view, and if we look in the list view, I have a directives folder, and inside the directives folder I have my board, freehand, and prototype directives. So nothing else in the application needs to know about this, right? There's no other UI that needs to render a prototype tile that is designed for the list of prototypes. So because of that, there's no reason I would ever have it in a root portion of the application or like a shared portion, because it's not shared. So in this case, it's specific to this view, and the happy benefit of having sort of a one-to-one ratio of modules to routable views is that I get to then declare those directives as local to this view module. I get to create really local specific naming conventions, right? This isn't like projects, list, view, board, item, component. It's just board, item, component, and it can be simple like that because it's scoped to this particular list view. It doesn't have to worry about name collisions with other things that might be called board items somewhere else in the application. It's a little bit verbose. It feels a little bit unfortunate to have to create a module for most of my routable views. But the reality is I found that the benefits outweighed the verbosity, and the ability to declare things locally and have my routes defined. That all quickly made up for the fact that, oh man, I have to create a module here for every time I create a new view. And of course, it's not entirely true, right? So if we look at something like in the modals, if we go into the modals here and we look at the share prototype. So if we look at the share prototype, quickly, let's just jump into one of these and let's share it. Inside here, these things, URL, email, SMS, these are all parts of the route as well, right? So if I'm in SMS here and I refresh, what you'll see is that we end up right back in the SMS view, and that's because SMS is driven by the route. And then that makes each one of these a separate view. But because this is such a small, cohesive area of the application, if we look inside URL, SMS, and email view, you see that these don't have modules. And that's because in this case, all I did was load them directly into the parent view, and I do the declaration there in the parent view, and you can see that the routes here, instead of deferring to the quote-unquote children views, I just pull those up into the into the share modal here itself as the module. So again, not a one-to-one ratio of modules to routable views, but I definitely erred in that direction. Now, while we're on the share, let me just share one last thing, no pun intended, that might be interesting here. And that's that the share modal itself is what's responsible for locating the particular prototype and defining the short URL. But each one of these subviews actually has to know about that, right? We're seeing the URLs being provided here. And the way I ended up doing that, and I don't know if I love this, but it seemed like the right way to go, is that if we look at the share prototype, and let me jump back here to a more code-oriented view. If we look at the share prototype view component has all the things like the prototype and the share URL. But if we look at, say, the SMS view, the way I share from a child to a parent is I actually get the instance of the share prototype view, which is the parent component, and I inject it into the SMS view. So here I'm able to actually, so just to paint the context here, from the SMS view, which is here, I'm injecting the instance of the modal window itself, which is the share prototype view. And from the instance of that modal, from the instance of that parent view, if we look at the HTML, I'm actually grabbing the prototype data off of the parent view, or the share URL off of the parent view. And if we jump back into the share prototype component for a second, right, you can see that's what's being defined on that parent. So that was just an interesting way I found to share information from a parent-child perspective. There's a myriad of other ways. You could do a shared service. You could do some sort of a registry where the child registers itself with the parent. This seemed like the most straightforward. Of course, the use cases weren't overly complex, and I didn't have to worry about necessarily updating state over time, so on and so forth. But anyway, sorry, I'm rambling here just because I feel like there's so much to see. I'm trying to think if there's anything interesting that I haven't showed you. I don't think so. One of the other things that was interesting to really noodle about was the stacked key combinations, right? So for example, if I'm looking at the view here and I hit left and right, you can see that I'm changing the view being used, or the screen that we're on. But if I go in here and I go left and right, sorry, let me go like into this one. If I'm in here and I go left and right, you can see that we're not actually changing the view, and that's because I have this keyboard shortcut listener service that I create that allows you to associate key events with priorities. And then those priorities determine how a key event can propagate up the hierarchy of views. Not necessarily hierarchy, just views in general. But I think about it as a hierarchy most of the time. I'm trying to think there's another... another thing that's interesting that I enjoyed was, so like right now, I'm scrolling here, right, obviously. And if I go to add this, you'll notice that there's no more scroll bar on the body, and that's because all of the modals are contained inside a secondary outlet, and that secondary outlet is responsible for for preventing scrolling on the body. It's a little bit hard to see on that one, but actually if we go into this one where I have scrolling and we do the share, which has a transparent background, you can see that there's no scroll bar there. And if I do the scroll wheel here, you can actually see that we don't scroll the body at all. And I'll just show you that because I think it's kind of interesting. So if we look at just to show you the file structure here, right? So here's my modal view, which contains my secondary outlet for all of my modals. So these are all my modals. And here's the component that wraps all of my modals. And if we look at this guy, what we can see is that on init, it calls this DOM utils that I created, and it hides the HTML overflow. So that means on the HTML element itself, it's hiding the overflow, and then anytime the modal layout is destroyed, I show the HTML overflow. And you can see that here, right, where I don't have any scroll bars, and if I hit escape, you'll see that the scroll bar comes back, and that's because the modal layout is re-enabling the ability for the body to scroll. And this way you don't get that ridiculous behavior you see in a lot of applications where you go to scroll and you see things scrolling in the background. Anyway, I think that's basically it. There's like so much stuff. This was, I mean, you know, like I said, it took me 4.5 months on and off, lots of tangential explorations. Yeah, anyway, I don't expect anybody to look at this and view this as a best practices approach to the Angular router. This is nothing more than the solution and approach that I've come up with after sort of toiling in a very non-trivial context with, I think, non-trivial requirements like secondary outlets and URL routing and state management and so on and so forth. But I'm sufficiently pleased with this that I would say that this is what I'm going to use the next time I start a router-based application. But of course, if anybody has any expert guidance, I'm always all ears. I want nothing more than to learn and understand this stuff better. So if anybody has any feedback, please let me know.